Once again, I'm Mark Hill, chair of the CCC, and it's my privilege to introduce Peter Harsha. Many years ago, Henry Kissinger complained that with respect to foreign policy, Europe had no phone number because it was a disjoint, chaotic operation. In many ways, for the United States government, computer science had no phone number in the United States 10 or 15 years ago. And with CRA and CCC, we're sort of trying to be that phone number. To be more effective, we have to understand how government works and also make our case to government. And Peter is instrumental in both of those functions. He explains to many of us how government works, which is different than you might get on PBS or Fox News. And he helps us influence government. Now, I should note that we do not lobby. Lobby is a very specific thing when you're asking for votes on specific legislation. But we do try to show that computer science provides great value to the citizens and taxpayers of the United States and make the case that investing further might be a good idea. So Peter has been with the CRA since the dawn of the millennium, October 2001. It's kind of scary. And that shows you how useful he has been. Prior to that, he worked in Congress for Nick Smith of Michigan and served on the House Science Committee. So he has a lot of insight on how staffers work and how if you're going to have a meeting with them, you bring breakfast burritos and other important things. And you know, had oversight of such things as the National Science Foundation, which we all know and love, and provides over 80% of the funding in computer science. So with that, Peter.
Thank you very much, Mark. I should say the talk I'm about to give is a very abridged version of a talk I would give the participants to our Leadership in Science Policy Institute, which is something I'll talk about in a little bit. Despite that, there's still a ton of content here. Fortunately, I've had like 4 cups of coffee at this point, so I'm going to plow on through. As Mark said, I'm the Director of Government Affairs for CRA. CRA is the parent organization of CCC. Our policy staff at CRA consists of myself and Brian Mosley, who is our policy analyst, and we staff CRA's policy efforts. This summer, we're also helped out by our Eben Tisdale Policy Fellow, Amita Shukla, who's a rising junior in computer engineering with a minor in political science at Columbia. So if you see her around, she's attending the conference today. Please say hi to her. We're also directed in our efforts by a Government Affairs Committee, which is filled with all of these august names. It's a subcommittee of our board of directors. It's chaired by Stephanie Forrest of Arizona State University, who some of you may know. These committee members are very engaged and they help us set the strategic direction of our policy efforts and help do a lot of the sort of day-to-day decision making about where we go in terms of our policy activities. So the standard version of this talk is for me to explain why CRA does policy, how we do it, how we work with other groups in the space, how we deal with the challenges of that, both the long-term challenges, which are like the fiscal environment that we inhabit and the political environment, the short-term challenges, which are all the various bills and regulations and investigations and things that can affect the computing research ecosystem. And I will cover all of that to some degree. But a lot of things have changed since January 20th, 2017 in the policy world specifically. And so it's worth talking about how some of those changes have affected our efforts, and so I'll do a bit of that as well. But let me first describe how it is that we do our policy work, and we can start with why CRA actually cares about policy, and the short answer is because it's in our mission to care. Essentially, we're charged by our membership with overseeing the health of the research and development ecosystem, particularly the computing research ecosystem here in town. We're part of a really active computing policy community. There's a really nice division of labor within that community as well. And so while we've taken on the role of ensuring the health of the R&D ecosystem, there are other organizations in the space that have taken on responsibility for other parts of the portfolio. And so for example, USACM, which is the US Public Policy Committee for ACM, looks at things like privacy and security and e-voting and digital government and a variety of other issues. And then you've got groups like Code.org and Computing in the Core that have taken on the charge of K through 12 computer science education issues. And IEEE USA is the policy arm for IEEE, and it's big on workforce and science advocacy. And then there's a whole other list and acronym soup of different organizations that each carve out pieces of the portfolio that we care about. Each of these organizations works together on these issues, but we've all kind of deferred leadership on the ones that are outside of our organizational missions. So other organizations lean pretty heavily on CRA for providing the leadership in this overseeing the research and development ecosystem piece of the portfolio, and we lean heavily on other organizations for their leadership in the other pieces of the portfolio. So traditionally, at least in the last 17 years or so that I've been doing this for CRA, that portfolio of policy efforts is, again, focused on this idea of ensuring the health of the research and development ecosystem. And that means we spend a lot of time worrying about three particular kind of classes of issues. And the first is access to talent. And this is making sure that US universities have access to the best students in the world. So we worry about student visa issues. We've worried about that a lot recently. It also means that we care about universities having access to the best faculty. Otherwise, we don't do much on the workforce side of things. We won't weigh in on the H-1B issue, for example, primarily because industry groups already do a pretty good job of that. And frankly, our own membership is a little bit conflicted on that issue as well. But it also means we care about the STEM education pipeline, along with lots of other groups in DC. Given our graduate school focus, we don't often take the lead on K through 12 computer science efforts, so we're certainly active participants and strong allies of our affiliates like ACM and IEEECS and groups like Code.org and NCWIT and Computing in the Core. The second category is impediments to research, and this is things like laws or regulations that have the intended or unintended effect of impeding research in computing. And the classic example is something like the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, which had anti-circumvention provisions in it that prevented computer security researchers from reverse engineering software or hardware. But this could also mean things like proposed export regulations that that are aimed at limiting the transfer of sensitive technologies and might affect the way that universities allow foreign graduate students to interact with certain tools. But traditionally, we spent the most significant fraction of our time worrying about research funding and priorities. And this means we care a lot about the money, how much is being spent, where it's being spent, and by whom, and on what. We are the organization within the policy space that has this as its primary focus. This is its central concern. And despite the current situation in Washington, that likely won't change. But in the last 19 months or so, we've spent an increasing share of our time contending with problems beyond the usual funding issues. And I would argue that the change in administration and the resulting change in the sort of infrastructure for doing science policy within the administration is arguably the reason for that. So I'd like to spend a little time discussing that. And that's why this part of the discussion is why I subtitled the talk, Does Science Policy Still Matter? Because the answer is of course, yes, it still does. But you could be forgiven if, given the whole spate of news reports about the general state of science in the new administration, had made you question whether or not that were true. The last time I gave this talk, just 2 weeks ago at our biennial Snowbird Chairs Conference in Utah, I went on for some length about how the Trump administration, by neglecting this infrastructure for science policy within the executive branch, was prone to missteps and some outright hostile policies towards the US science enterprise. And that's still true, but I'm just going to blow through them now because, as is often the case in DC, events overtake your best preparations for slides. And so we have new developments in that space that I'll report here in a second. But I was going to talk about how the New York Times very nicely set me up for this by putting out a helpful article that framed the extent of the changes in the space. There are a whole bunch of things that the administration hasn't quite done for science since they've been in charge for the last 19 months or so, and I would go through all of that. Then I talk about the office that I really wanted to talk about, which is Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is sort of the headquarters for this infrastructure of science policy within the White House. Then I had some snarky graphics, an org chart of OSTP that I was going to highlight all the current vacancies in there, and they get really snarky and say the whole place is run at the moment by this gentleman who is Michael Kratsios. He's the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for the US government. He's also, at the moment, the highest ranking person in OSTP. He's a 31-year-old political science major, former chief of staff for venture capitalist Peter Thiel. And he's been the guy at OSTP running things. And so OSTP got off to a very slow start in the administration, but over the last few months has actually ramped up its efforts in meaningful ways. And I've lost my cursor. Where's my cursor? Okay. The OSTP has brought on board Jim Carosi, for example, over from NSF SAIS to run an effort in AI and machine learning, and there's a new select committee of the National Science and Technology Council on AI and machine learning, and a new interagency working group of the Networking and Information Technology Research and Development Program. Also in AI and machine learning, they have a similar thrust in quantum information science that's been launched, and another in high performance computing. So there have been some activities. However, it's not been very, whoops, gotta go through all this again. It hasn't been clear to me, given that the office has remained essentially leaderless over these 19 months, how they will make use of the products of those efforts. Whether somebody like Kratsios had the stature to bring things to the attention of the president or the Domestic Policy Council, or go toe-to-toe with someone like Mick Mulvaney, who runs the White House Office of Management and Budget, over things like what the administration's commitment to research is in the research budget. And I'd argue that the early results certainly weren't promising. The president's budget's requests have really deprioritized science within his administration. And there have been a series of recent policy decisions that make it pretty clear that those overseeing the nation's S&T enterprise aren't really having the influence or impact necessary to shape administration policies in positive ways. However, yesterday, the president announced his intention to nominate Kelvin Drogemeyer, who is currently the VP for Research at the University of Oklahoma, to head the Office of Science and Technology Policy, and this is a good thing. He's fairly well known to the computing community. He's collaborated with a lot of folks. He is a severe storms expert, not a climate denier. He is a frequent collaborator, like I say, with many in the computing research community. He's also the first non-physicist to be nominated to be director of OSTP since the office was founded in '76, so this is a positive change too. Not that I have anything personally against the physicists, but don't get me started. No. So we have some hopes on our Government Affairs Committee within CRA that having somebody with the stature of Drogemeyer in charge will help prevent some of the sorts of missteps that we've seen over the last 19 months, that are the result of the result of an administration that's acting without the sort of infrastructure for science policy. But we'll see. Some of those missteps include, and I won't go through these because I don't have a ton of time, but if you want to ask about them later, I'm happy to talk about them. Things like within days of the presidential inauguration, a travel ban that would have really impacted graduate studies and in computer science. Current restrictions on Chinese graduate students who wish to come to the US to study robotics or advanced manufacturing or aviation that would limit them to 1-year student visa terms that are renewable as opposed to the 5 that are currently available now. Proposed restrictions in House Defense Bill language that would put restrictions on researchers who have received some support from Chinese entities, and it's unclear what Chinese entities means. Does it mean if you've got support from a Confucius Institute that might be hosted at your school, or does it mean you've gotten support from Huawei to support some of your research or some other Chinese company? If you've received that money, the new restrictions would allow the Secretary of Defense to prohibit you from receiving any defense funding in the future. So you'd no longer be eligible for DARPA or IARPA or any other sort of research funding. And then I would even argue H.R. 1, which was the sort of signature tax bill of the Republicans in Congress this year, had provisions that would tax graduate students based on the tuition waivers that they received. So if you received a tuition waiver as part of your graduate assistantship, that would be treated as taxable income under the House tax plan. I'd argue if that infrastructure for science policy still existed in the administration, somebody could have at least pointed out how detrimental that would be to the field, how less attractive it would make a graduate study in computing, for example, rather than going off and working in industry. So, does science policy still matters? I would argue yes, it still does. I think it's really important that having an infrastructure for science policy within the executive branch, which is basically a bureaucracy that can help vet presidential and administration policies before they're released in the wild, a bureaucracy that can help bring scientific expertise into policy discussions, a bureaucracy that can help advocate from within the administration for the importance of sound science and continued research. I think those are all important parts of having a really effective government. Giving science a seat around the policymaking table makes for better policy. Now, different administrations have placed different values on the views coming from that seat, but that seat has at least always been around the table. Maybe now with Drogemeyer's nomination to OSDP, we're seeing the first signs that this administration is beginning to let science at least into the room, if not quite at the table yet. So we're seeing that as a positive sign. We're going to keep monitoring this. We're full of hope at this point. So it's been a very challenging 19 months or so. For the first time in my memory, we've probably spent as much time on the other two aspects of this issue portfolio as we have worrying about money and the overall federal investment in computing. But we do still continue to worry about that federal investment and about funding and priorities. And we face lots of challenges in that mission too, which includes competition from special interest groups, difficulties posed by the process itself, the long-term fiscal realities that we face in government, and changing political attitudes towards science. And so I want to talk about all of those to a degree. Let's start with the process and the sort of the challenges of the special interest groups. So it turns out that there are lots of other people in Washington that are worrying about the same thing. This list, which is really hard to read, I'm sure for you, is just some of the groups that are registered to lobby here in town about these issues. Last year, last full year of data that we have, there were about 11,500 plus folks or entities registered to lobby in the US, and they billed their clients collectively about $3.4 billion last year to do that. Just working in the science and technology issue space, which is the issue space that CRA primarily cares about, there are 304 different groups that are registered to lobby in that space, again, billing big numbers. And this doesn't even represent CRA because, as Mark pointed out, we don't do a lot of lobbying. In fact, we don't spend enough on our direct lobbying efforts to meet the threshold for reporting as part of the Lobbyist Disclosure Act. So though Brian and I do policy and we're the closest thing that CRA has to lobbyists, we're not actually lobbyists, which is a good thing because it actually means that there are less constraints on us to go meet with different folks in the administration than there might be if we were actually registered lobbyists. But there are a lot of folks out there worrying about the same thing. And so for a significant percentage of our time, this is what we and the great bulk of those other groups are worried about, which is the federal budget, $4.4 billion in FY19. But of course, we're not actually worrying about all of that money because a lot of it, in fact, most of it is spent on autopilot. Mandatory spending is money that Congress doesn't get to appropriate every year. It's spent by formula. So this is Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps. There's also interest that has to be paid on the national debt every year. And all of that makes up the bulk of federal spending every year, and it's all completely automatic. So what we're really talking about is only $1.3 trillion, the so-called discretionary spending budget, or the amount that Congress has to decide every year how to spend to keep all federal agency programs running. And then that amount is further subdivided into 12 separate appropriations bills every year. And the implication of this is actually pretty important for policy efforts in particular. It means that Congress effectively divides that $1.3 trillion into 12 separate pots of money. And that money, once it's in a pot, is very, very difficult to move to another pot. So from an advocacy perspective, if science agencies, if we hope, for example, that science agencies will receive adequate funding or increased budgets in the coming year, we need to make sure that the appropriators put enough money in the appropriate pots to fund the agencies that we care about. So if we want to make sure that NSF is adequately funded, and we do, because as Mark pointed out, they support about 82% of all university-based computer science research in the US, then we want to make sure that the Commerce Justice Science pot up there is adequately filled. Ditto for Department of Energy, we've got to make sure the energy and water pot is filled. So these pots have the effect of reshaping the debate for science advocates. Appropriations is truly a zero-sum game. Once these bills are written, if we're not happy with the amounts that are included for any of the agencies that we care about, we need to find somebody in Congress who's willing to amend the bill to add more money. But in order to add more money to a program or to an agency in the bill, we've got to find somewhere else in the bill to take that money away. So if NSF is our target agency, we need to look elsewhere in the Commerce Justice Science bill to fund the increase we hope them to see. And here are the other agencies in the bill. So you've got 4 science agencies in NSF, NIST, NOAA, and NASA. Then you've got the FBI, Department of Justice, and the Department of the Census. So this leads to some difficult arguments. NSF can be pitted against programs of justice that provide grants to local law enforcement for bulletproof vests. It could be pitted against NASA for launch vehicles, or satellites for NOAA, or more census takers. And it means that advocates for all those programs can look to the funding that NSF receives as a way to pay for the programs that they want as well. So we end up playing a lot of defense in this role as well. So those are kind of the key procedural challenges that are posed by the House and the Senate rules, which is the process by which money is appropriated by Congress. But there's a whole other dimension of challenges as well, and those are posed by the fiscal environment that we're operating in right now and the political nature of the process. So we'll start with the fiscal, and this is a chart provided by the Congressional Budget Office on the growth in mandatory spending versus discretionary spending. And obviously note that all the increase that's projected over the next 10 years, or at least out to 2026 in this chart, is in mandatory spending. Again, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, programs that are all on autopilot. Discretionary spending, the stuff that we care about, the programs that Congress appropriates every year, including NSF and NASA and NIH and DoD, that's all in that yellow box, which is pretty much held flat or declining over the course of the projection. To look at it another way, the share of the federal government that Congress gets to decide on every year gets smaller each year, and the deficit grows each year. And this is a real concern to policymakers because interest to maintain that debt is on track to become one of the largest single expenditures of the federal government. So we'll pay more to maintain our national debt than we will for defense or for Medicaid, or certainly for that small little piece at the bottom, which is the amount the federal government invests in science and technology. If that isn't depressing enough, the other factor I want to focus on for the next few minutes has to do with the changing attitude in Congress in particular, but also in the electorate for politics and its impact on science policy. So this is a chart put together by the Pew Research Center that tracks sort of the ideology of the electorate. And this is over the last 23 years or so from 94 to 2017. And you can see that the difference between the median Republican and the median Democrat has grown substantially apart over those 23 years. In fact, they're now farther apart than they have been at any time since the Civil War. To look at it another way, the overlap between those two ideologies, Republican and Democrat, has grown vanishingly small over that same period of time too. And this makes getting things done very difficult, obviously. There's much less room for compromise. And the Congress reflects this, the ideology here of the electorate as well. So Congress has become similarly polarized. And this polarization has certainly changed attitudes about science. As Mark said, I started my career with the House Science Committee, and at that time, it was traditionally one of the most bipartisan collegial committees on the Hill. But over the last few decades, it's actually fallen prey to some pretty bitter partisan battles as well over things like climate change research and federal support for political science and social science work. There have been a number of investigations into silly-sounding science, which usually comes from some staffer searching the NSF database for some, janky sort of keywords. And those most often misinterpret the purpose of the research based, like I say, on these keyword searches. Science policy bills that ought to pass unanimously and used to, at a regular basis, now pass frequently on party line votes to serve political purposes more than to serve the nation's scientific enterprise. It's often more about denying the minority or the majority a win during an election year, for example. So the challenges that we face in this space are pretty daunting, and we have a much more limited toolbox than most of those other 304 organizations do that I showed you at the very outset. We're a 501c3, a nonprofit. We don't have a PAC, so we don't contribute to campaign of any of the members of Congress. We also don't have a lot of resources to fly members of Congress on fact-finding trips around the country or around the world to buy access. We literally just have the strength of the story that we tell when we go into their offices. Fortunately, we've got a pretty good story. And so what I want to do now for the next few minutes is sort of walk you through the case that we make when we go up to the Hill to talk about the importance of the federal investment in research and in computing in particular. So this is our talking points. If you do a Congressional Business Day with us, you'll get a copy of this and you'll get a nice little briefing about how to use it. I'm going to walk you through them now just so you get a sense of the kind of conversation that we have when we go in and talk to members of Congress and their staffs. So the first point that we make is advances in IT are transforming all aspects of our lives. And we can go through a whole set of examples, from the way we buy and sell things to the way we teach our students and teach our grown-ups too as well, from where we work and how we work and who we work with, how we take care of ourselves, how our healthcare professionals take care of us, how our communities understand the health needs amongst their citizenry, how we build things, where we build things, when we build things, how we ship things, how government functions, not only how government agencies can deliver services to their constituents, but how the citizenry also keeps an eye on what our government officials are doing and from whom they're receiving funding. Of course, national security, both helping protect us, but maybe also creating new threats as well, although I guess that's not really a great thing to point out. How we communicate, how we can reach out essentially anywhere in the world in milliseconds and find anyone, and obviously how we spend our downtime, how we're entertained as well. We can also make the point that advances in IT drive the US economy, continue to drive the US economy, and we can point to a whole set of statistics that show that it's not just the growth in the IT sector itself that's driving the economy, but the innovations that sort of spring from that sector that then go on to improve productivity across the US economy that do it. We can make the case that advances in computing are enabling innovation in all other fields of science. We can show that computer modeling and visualization and data analysis have joined observation, theory, and experiment as real drivers of scientific discovery. So we have this really impressive history that we can fall back on and talk about, but what's really compelling to members of Congress and their staff is the future. What does the future look like? What is the research that they're supporting right now potentially leading to? And so if you're along with us on our congressional visit, this is the point at which we'd love to have you talk about your own research and the impact that it can have on the world. But we can talk about things like the future of networking and revolutionizing transportation, delivering personalized education, a teacher for every learner, enabling the energy grid, empowering the developing world, improving healthcare, driving advances in all fields in science and engineering. In short, we can say with a straight face that it is really impossible to imagine a field with a greater opportunity to change the world. At which point, members of Congress and their staff usually say, that sounds fantastic. Why do we care as part of the federal government? It sounds like you got this nailed. And then we talk about the IT research and development ecosystem and the fact that that ecosystem is crucial to innovation in IT, and federal support is really at the heart of that ecosystem. The National Research Council has a great quote describing this research and development ecosystem. They say, they call it an extraordinarily productive interplay of federally funded university research, federally and privately funded industrial research, and entrepreneurial companies founded and staffed by people who move back and forth between universities and industry. And then they attempted to capture that, this is the Computer Science and Telecommunications Board of the National Academies, attempted to capture this in this slide, which we call the tire tracks chart. I'm wondering how many of you have ever seen this chart? Only a few. Awesome. Okay, so this is new. It's called the tire tracks chart because it looks like it was run over. It's got these lines in it. It's essentially a timeline, and we love this chart because it's almost impossible to perceive the meaning of it just if somebody handed it to you. You kind of have to watch. So when we sit down with members of Congress or their staff, it creates an opportunity for a conversation between us, and we walk them through this narrative. And the narrative is great because it makes our case for basic research for us. And so I'll describe the chart for you now. So it is a timeline. It starts at 1965 or 65 down there on the bottom and goes up to 2010. And it divides essentially the IT economy into a bunch of different subsectors of the economy. And so for each subsector of the economy, there are 3 lines. The red line indicates where work in that space began in US universities, largely with federal funding. The blue line in the middle is when industrial research labs began work in that area, largely with private funding. The third line where the dots appear is when the first product appeared in that space. Where the dots turn solid indicates when that space became a $1 billion sector of the US economy. Where they become sort of double thick represents where that sector became a $10 billion plus sector of the US economy. What's harder to see are all the little arrows that run between all the different sectors and between the different players in each of the space. And those represent actual documented instances of either people or ideas flowing back and forth between the different performers in the space or between the different sectors. At the very top, there's a whole bunch of companies that are listed, and they're roughly grouped above the areas that they sort of emerged from. I once, as an exercise, tried to figure out how much these companies contribute to the US economy annually, and just the first 8 or so represented about $800 billion to $1 trillion. in the US economy. So this is a substantial piece of the US economy every year that comes out of this ecosystem and grew out of this ecosystem. So walking through this chart with members of Congress allows us the opportunity to make the case for basic research, which is, for example, basic research often takes a long time before it pays off. In a number of cases on the chart, you can see that the earliest research is more than 15 years before the introduction of the first product in the space. It often pays off in unanticipated ways, like developments in one sector often enable advances in others, often serendipitously. It also shows that the work that goes on in universities doesn't supplant the work that's going on in industry, and vice versa. That research performed in universities is generally different, a completely different character than research that's funded by industry. That industry is generally focused on the next product cycle or two, not 5 or 10 years out. It's also difficult for industry to capture the benefits of early stage scientific research because the results of that research by nature are available to everyone. And it also shows that the payoffs of the early stage research is often unpredictable, which makes it somewhat less attractive for industry as well. But on the whole, I hope the chart shows that the research ecosystem is fueled by this flow of people and ideas back and forth from university and industry, and this robust ecosystem has really made the US the world leader in information technology. Each one of these sectors bears the clear stamp of federal investment, and these are investments that have demonstrated extraordinary payoffs. So payoff in the explosion of new technologies that have touched literally every aspect of our lives, and in the economic payoff in the creation of new industries and literally millions of new jobs. To emphasize that last point, we then have this chart, which we hand them, which is the US Bureau of Labor Statistics does 10-year job projections every couple of years. And so this shows that the projection through 2024 says that of all the newly created jobs, that is jobs that don't exist right now in the STEM fields, fully 76% of them will be in computing-related areas. Of total jobs, which means jobs that both exist now but people are going to retire within the next 10 years, and new jobs, fully 60%, almost 60%, 58% of those positions will be in computing-related fields as well. So if you're talking about STEM job growth, you're really talking about computing. Okay, so we've got a pretty good story. How do we tell it? Well, first, we're really opportunistic. We take advantage of any request we get for comment or requests for testimony. We do a lot of congressional testimony. There are folks in the room, I think, who have participated, like Greg Hager's down here and Keith Marzullo. Kathy Yellick is a member of CCC, or just was a member of CCC, just stepped down. She's also at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab just 3 weeks ago, testified before the House Committee on Science. We also do a lot of our own hosting of events, and we partner with a lot of other groups in town to host events as well. So we don't necessarily wait to get asked to go in and talk. We do one-on-one briefings with members. We hold congressional luncheons or congressional breakfasts, which is where we've learned that having breakfast burritos at a morning briefing is a great way of guaranteeing turnout. We do sort of science fair sort of things. We even speak on behalf of other disciplines as well. For example, the social, behavioral, and economic scientists wanted us up there to talk about how important SBE is to computer science as well, and we were happy to do that. So we've developed a good brand in the space. We're seen as a nonpartisan group that gives good technical advice and does truly represent the community we claim to represent. So they reach out to us, they know that they're getting the view, as best we can tell, of the computing research community. We strive to engage that community in policymaking. One of the ways we do that is through this Leadership in Science Policy Institute that I was talking about. Somebody described it as Science Policy Boot Camp, which is perfect for me. That sounds great. This is something that we do about every 18 to 24 months. It's a partnership between CRA and CCC. The idea of it is it's a 1.5-day workshop for mid-career faculty, so post-tenure folks. So as you folks begin getting your tenure, or if you've already gotten your tenure and you have a little bit of time to think about service in some way, LISP would be a great thing to think about. It's a 1.5-day workshop that's kind of like Civics 601. It's the graduate level course about how science policy gets made particularly for computing researchers. So folks from the White House, folks from the agencies, congressional staff, and then professionals in advocacy like me and some other folks that we drag into it, show you how the sausage gets made. It's a day and a half, it's pretty intensive, and it's great. Our ideal outcome of this sort of effort is to create this sort of cadre of researchers who are really well-versed in science policy, and for us can be a rapid response, kind of geographically diverse group that can make the case for computing whenever we need it. But I think more importantly, it's to really help the attendees of this get a grasp and become comfortable enough with how policy gets made to be more effective in your own spheres of influence. If you're going to be a leader in the science policy community, you really do, or a leader in the computing community, excuse me, you really need to understand how science policy gets made. That's such an important part of how our field gets funded. LISP is a great way to do that. So our next one will be in the fall of 2019. If you're in that sort of mid-career, post-tenure world then, think about nominating. Otherwise, the one after that will be in 2021. Please think about attending. We also do things like congressional visits days. Our next one is September 12th, 13th. This is basically representatives from our member institutions come out on their own dime. We set up a day of meetings with them, with our own representatives in Congress, and they come help make the case for computing research. We give them a little orientation session where we ply them full of info and then give them a reception where we give them a lot of alcohol and free food and then send them up to the hill. It works out really well, believe it or not. Those meetings are, there's a bit of serendipity in the meetings that have real impact, and then a lot of meetings don't seem to have impact, but then several months down the line, you'll get a phone call from the office that says, hey, you came in and met with me, I've got this really tricky policy question about computing, could you help me answer it? Or maybe I need help with Java on my website or something, I don't know. But any connection with the representatives that you have in DC is a good one. We're also part of this broader advocacy community that's really looking for good stories to tell. The case for computing research is really tangible to members of Congress. They understand this sort of linear case of fundamental research here led to my iPhone, or led to the iPad, the thing that I have in my hand. It's a lot harder for other groups in the sciences to make the case for like astronomy or the Higgs boson. Those are much more abstract cases to make. So we're often trotted out as part of these group efforts as the poster child for the value of the federal investment in research, and we're happy to do that. We do subscribe to the rising tide floats all boats sort of school of thought about science funding in DC. We try not to pit the different disciplines against each other. We do join lots of coalitions around our interests. If you know anything about DC, you know that a coalition forms around every single issue in town, and so there's a whole alphabet soup of different groups that we belong to. We also try to leverage every interaction we have with the press so that some of this messaging gets through. If they're talking about some current subject, we also want to make the case for the federal investment. We've got social media that we try to leverage. I hope you all subscribe to our blog, like our Facebook, and follow our Twitter, which is all up here. And we've had some successes. Obviously, it's no surprise that the Obama administration were big fans of computing research and particularly computer science education efforts. And so this is President Obama welcoming the Hour of Code a couple of years ago in a video. But the Trump administration has actually been equally enthused about computing issues, particularly computer science education issues. Ivanka, in particular, is very keen on computer science, K-12 computer science education. So there's been a lot of good rhetoric about the importance of our discipline, but how about where the rubber hits the road? Is that translated into more funding for the field? In September, the administration actually directed the Department of Education to commit $200 million a year for STEM and computer science efforts at the Department of Education. The Secretary of Education followed that up by identifying STEM plus CS as one of the 11 priorities for that agency. That represents a first for our field. We've had a hard time sort of cracking the nut of Department of Education and seeing that grant funding from Department of Education could flow into CS efforts. It's always been, well, CS is kind of outside of STEM. Now it's sort of very directly and very explicitly within STEM, and so that's opened up a new source of funding for those particularly interested in doing computer science education work with the states. Similarly, the Department of Education has an Education Innovation and Research Program, which will grant up to $115 million this year to STEM, CS, and other programs. There isn't a national set of priorities yet out of the new OSTP, other than, like I say, there are new efforts in AI and machine learning and quantum information science and HPC. But NSF does still have its 10 big ideas, and it's pretty clear that computing is directly included in 4 of those, and probably you can make a case that just about every one of those has a SICE sort of contingent to it as well. And then this is a chart that AAAS actually put together to highlight a particular bill's impact on the Social, Behavioral, and Economics Directorate at NSF and what it would do. It was going to kill that directorate almost. But what it does is it charts the growth of all the other directorates since 2000. The gray line on top is the SICE directorate. So SICE has actually grown disproportionate compared to all the other directorates. It's exceeded the growth on a percentage basis of any of the other directorates. And this has more to do with the fact that the ADs for SICE, the leaders at SICE, have done a great job of positioning computing as being essential to national priorities, national research priorities. So pretty much every priority that the Obama administration announced had some significant research component to it. NSF is very good, or the folks at SICE are very good at making sure that all the NSF priorities have a big SICE piece in it as well, and that's how you grow the SICE budget. And so we might not make the most noise in town, but we accomplish a lot, even if it's under the radar here. The physicists are very loud in town, but we've outperformed them. Hey. And then just some positive trends. You can look at these slides when they go up online. The last two, but we know what's happened in FY18 because the appropriations for FY18 are done, and NSF received a 5% bump, and the Advanced Scientific Computing Research Program at DOE received about a 25% bump, much of that in exascale, which also received a 25% bump. We're expecting sort of similar levels of increase as we go through FY19, next year's appropriations process, which will wrap up sometime after the election. There are new initiatives in AI and big data at DOE. There are new activities at OSTP, as I said, and both the House and the Senate have both created and marked up bills to create a new national initiative in quantum information science, which will include big pieces in computing as well. So despite the challenging environment that I've been talking about, it's actually not all bad news for computing. Our ability to keep making this case, though, is heavily dependent on having more voices joining our chorus. So I hope I painted a picture that shows that despite the recent successes, this is still a dicey time for science and science policy. The technologies our field have created have in turn created some incredibly positive impacts on our society and our world, but also some serious challenges. You've heard about some of them over the course of this symposium. The policies that surround their development and use get thornier and more tangled every day. So I'd argue that it's worth your time, especially as you grow in seniority and grow in the field, to spend some portion of your time engaged in the policymaking that oversees all of that. So what follows in the last couple of minutes that I have here is a range of possible levels of engagement, some that are easy and some that are hard. This is in part an advertisement for some of the things that you can do with CRA in Washington, but it's also a list of things that you might consider doing on your own and within your own spheres of influence. So, like I say, as you grow in your career and you have more time, first is participate in a Congressional Business Day. We make it really easy for you. I've made it really easy to sign up. I will repeat that QR code at the very end if you want to just snap it. I'll give you all the information you need. If there are colleagues at your institutions that have an interest in this sort of thing, please pass this along as well. We generally get 25 to 30 folks show up for Congressional Business Day every year. I would love to see more of that. You can also, again, sort of send yourself or nominate your colleagues or look to your colleagues to go to this LISP that I described. Again, great way to learn the sausage making of science policy to help you be a better leader in the field. Participate in CRA briefings or hearings if you're asked. Participating in CCC workshop activities like this is a great way to get known to CRA policy staff, and we generally like to use the people that we know to help convey our messaging to policymakers. So if you want to get asked to join CRA briefings on things, just keep doing CCC sort of things, and we'll find you. As you get more senior, consider running for the CRA board. Serve on CRA committees if asked. Many of you will go on to become department chairs. In fact, probably all of you will. If you're here, you're motivated enough to become a department chair. If you become a department chair, there's some great suggestions as well. I stole these from Peter Swire, who spoke at Snowbird a couple years ago, but I think they're great. Your department chair should really send the message that policy engagement is valuable and valued by your school and the nation. You should, as a department chair, provide a recognition for public service, including highlighting the public policy work by your faculty or your students to the university leadership and to the general public, and value policy-related service during the promotion process. And now here are a bunch of things you can do as an individual. You don't have to do them through CRA. You can do them on your own time. I want to caveat it by first saying, remember, you're all either citizens or residents of this country. You all have a right to go talk to your representatives despite what your institutional government affairs representatives might tell you. You can go talk. You might not be able to represent yourself as an employee of that particular institution or representing the views of that institution, but you can certainly go in and talk to your members. Having said that, though, most government affairs government affairs folks or government relations folks would be more than happy to have you carry a message like the one we want you to carry up to Congress on their behalf. In fact, they may even help you customize that message for the particular members of Congress that you might go see. So make a connection with your own institution's government affairs reps. They can be very useful in that regard. There are lots of things you can do to stay engaged. So in addition to talking to the federal folks, talk to your state and local representatives as well. Make the case to your industry partners. If you work with folks in industry, make sure that they understand this case for basic research. They turn out to be some of our best advocates in DC, especially when we're talking to conservative members of Congress. Industry carries so much more credibility, unfortunately, than the academic community does. If they go in and make this case, it carries twice the weight as when our academic partners do that. Join the policy conversation. Serve on advisory committees. So again, if you make yourself aware to your government affairs reps at your institutions, they can often point out opportunities to serve on agency advisory committees, or note if there's some sort of privacy body or executive branch advisory committee that needs nominations. They tend to track that sort of stuff and they can hook you up. You can spend some time serving in an agency, a science agency or non-science agency. It's getting increasingly critical to have science folks embedded in non-science agencies, non-science mission agencies. Take a sabbatical and do a tech fellowship in Congress or an internship in Congress. We'll hear in a few minutes about tech fellowship opportunities. Submit comments and regulations in areas that you care about. If you don't know how to do that, we're happy to help you figure that out. Join other advocacy organizations. There are lots of groups out there that do more narrowly focused stuff than CRA does. Serve on their boards and committees. They always need volunteers and they need active folks. Engage in your local community. This one's important. Talk to your neighbors about what you do and why it's important. You should be able to tell them why your research is so important that you've taken 30% of their paycheck to pay for it, because in a sense you have. And if you can frame your research in that way, in a compelling enough way to convince the person that it was worth taking their hard-earned tax dollars to pay for it, you'll write better grant applications. You'll have far more success in selling your work. Similarly, go talk to your local Rotary clubs or Kiwanis clubs. This sounds strange, but I worked for a member of Congress who, anytime a scientist came in and made the pitch for fundamental research, he said, have you spoken to your local Rotary clubs? Because I have to go speak to those people. And if you can help me make that case before I get there, it's way easier for both of us. Write op-eds and letters to the editor and local papers about the importance of this investment. Let us know when you do that, and we'll help publicize it as well. And then sort of the long-term, more difficult commitments. Help your local schools be a mentor. We need a science-literate citizenry right now. Many of the problems I think that we face right now with fake news and all that have to do with citizenry that has a very difficult time differentiating fact from fiction. Having a more science-literate citizenry would go a long way to fixing that problem. And maybe the hardest, most advanced level on here, run for office. You would not be alone. There are 60 people this year with STEM backgrounds who are running in federal elections. That's a huge increase over previous years. And if even 10% of them go on to success, that will effectively double the science literacy of the Congress. So that would be fantastic. There are another 250 or so that are competing in state level elections and stuff, and then hundreds more who are running for their local school boards and stuff. This takes a higher level of commitment, but also has a potential for great impact on the country. So I'll just wrap up by saying the need for policymakers to understand the importance of research and the implications of technology may never have been greater. I hope you'll continue to help us do our best to represent the best aspects of the computing research community in Washington and wherever else you have the opportunity. And with that, I will wrap up. Thank you very much.
Okay, we have time for one question from a microphone as the next panelists come up.
A quick question. I wonder if you mentioned briefly whether kind of concerns about job displacement, kind of the more negative aspects where I think the community has been kind of too rah-rah for too many years to maintain much credibility. They've been, in many cases, been more seen as a industry apologist. In many cases, whether that's make things more challenging and whether CRA wants to take a more nuanced view as opposed to being indistinguishable from Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Amazon, you name the big ones. So.
That's a great question. And it's a big concern of mine. There is a big push, even among groups like the Robotics Caucus, Congressional Robotics Caucus, to continue to paint an only positive view of the impacts of adding more and more automation to the workforce. They do take a view that robotics only creates more jobs and fail to mention the jobs that get displaced as a result of that. I'm increasingly concerned that we as a field don't take that seriously enough and don't have a great answer to that. And I don't honestly have a great answer to that other than we can point out efforts that the CCC has tried to engage in through their visioning to focus on the augmenting of human technology so as not to replace these folks, but augment them, make them more productive. But of course, that replaces people as well. So no, these are the big policy challenges I think ahead of us, the displacement of workers and the impacts that our technologies have on the society that we're trying to serve, and they're not all positive. So,
All right.
thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Peter.